Good day, colleagues here in the room and online. Welcome to this interactive presentation of the 2024 Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. My name is Billy. I'm a program officer with the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes Civil Society Unit here in Vienna. And I have the pleasure to moderate this session with very distinguished panel members. And we, as you know, the Civil Society Unit, for those of you who are new to our work, indeed, we do have so many new colleagues, I think, joining us online. Just to let you know, we have received almost 600 interests of people who registered to participate in this presentation, which shows also the relevance of this report and the interest from civil society organizations. They come from 100 countries, so that's really globally. It covers most of the world, and so for us as UNODC Civil Society Unit is very important to serve as a gateway for non-governmental stakeholders engagement in the work of UNODC. And of course, we collaborate very closely with our different parts of the house, and it's good to see some of our colleagues from HTMSS. Morgan, welcome. And of course, on all issues related to organized crime, some of you might already be aware, we do this through the Civil Society Unit's Stakeholder Engagement for UNTOC project. Many of you know that as the AC4U project. And for this event, as I mentioned, we have really a lot of interest, and we organized this together with the research branch. Thanks, Fabrizio, for doing this once again since last year already. And we are very grateful for your participation and look forward to engaging with you fruitfully and very engagingly in this one. So for this, before we start, I wanted to mention that this event is organized in a hybrid format. So we have some people in the room here at the UN in Vienna, but we have most people already now. We have over almost 180 people online. So it's really a very good number. And we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation, at least in French, Russian, and Spanish. I think we're still waiting to fix the Arabic one. I think that should be, it's also working, not yet. So at least we have interpretation in French, Russian, and Spanish. So please do use that feature as well, just to listen and to contribute in the language that is most effective for you. So to get us started, just to take you through the running order of this event, we will have opening words from the chair of the NGO Alliance on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, Mr. Ian Tennant, sitting on my right. And thanks, Ian, for our partnership and for your active engagement throughout our activities. That will be followed then by the actual presentation by our colleague from Fabrizio Sarica, who is a coordinator of UNODC's research on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, who will take us through the report and some of the key findings of the report. Again, thank you, Fabrizio, for your engagement in this. After Fabrizio, then we will have a presentation, we'll have a reflection from Malaika Oringo, who is the founder and CEO of Footprint to Freedom, an international NGO that is dedicated to supporting and empowering survivors and victims of human trafficking. And Malaika is also the coordinator of the Africa Survivor Coalition, which is an important platform in the African continent for engaging survivors. And Malaika will provide the reflection to the presentation of the report. And thank you so much for your engagement with the UNODC in different capacities as well. So we're very grateful that you could join us here in Vienna. After all of those presentations, we will then open the floor for a Q&A session where we would like to interact with you. You can interact with the panel members, but we would also like to receive additional contributions from you. So for those of you joining us online, we would like you to request to speak so that we can activate your profile in order to request for the floor. And of course, those of you in the room, please feel free to raise your hand. So With that, I'm pleased to invite our colleague and partner, Ian Tennant, to provide some opening words. Ian, please.
Thank you very much, Billy. I'm speaking as chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, which is the umbrella body dealing with UNODC on all kinds of crime prevention and criminal justice issues, with more than 100 members from civil society around the world, many of which are dealing at the front lines with the harms and the impacts of human trafficking and supporting survivors, supporting victims, doing research. And we're very grateful for all of the work that our members and other parts of civil society are doing around the world. And we're also very grateful to the UNODC for inviting us here for this briefing today, and for the report that they've published, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons 2024, which was published at the end of last year, but we have the opportunity here today to discuss with civil society. For us, the Global Report is an important resource for governments, but also for civil society. But unfortunately, we think the report paints a depressing but also familiar picture, with trafficking in persons and the harms associated with it, unfortunately, on the rise. Different manifestations outlined in the reports, whether child trafficking, trafficking for forced labor, forced criminality, are all increasing. And this mirrors a broader trend in the increasing success, diversification, and resilience of organized criminal activities and groups. And I think for us, one of the most concerning statistics that we see in here was the increase in the percentage of victims of scam centers. This incredibly concerning phenomenon and the forced criminality and human trafficking, which forms part of that criminal ecosystem, are really reflected in this report, and something that's really coming through in media and other reporting, and the experience of NGOs on the ground as well. So for us in the Alliance, we are engaged across the different UNODC mandate areas, not just on trafficking in persons. And unfortunately, almost all manifestations of organized crime are causing increasing harm and concern. And that is despite the array of international instruments that the international community has at its disposal, including the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its Trafficking in Persons Protocol, the Palermo Protocol, to which almost all UN member states have signed up to and have done for a number of years. We think that civil society has a central role to play in the implementation of these instruments. And this is especially true when it comes to trafficking in persons, where survivors, victims, and the NGOs who support them have long been recognized, not only in the protocol, but also in the discussions around the protocol and in how it's practically implemented. But clearly, despite this, not enough is being done to address the various forms of human trafficking outlined in the start findings of the report. We note and support the recommendations, which call for increased support to survivors and to victims, increased support to civil society organizations, and increased collaboration between governments and civil society. But overall, from this report, we see a need for a stronger focus on resilience at the community level and cooperation between different sectors, not only civil society, but also the private sector, including for the reintegration of victims into the formal labor market. There is also a need for the changing role of technology to be better understood and better used for good in the response to human trafficking. And finally, and this is quite fundamental, what we need is not just technical implementation of the tools that we have available, but also addressing the problems of corruption and impunity, which allow human trafficking to, unfortunately, be as successful as it still is, and as pervasive as it still is. So we're very grateful for the opportunity. We're looking forward to seeing the presentation of the report and having a chance to have some questions and back and forth, and hearing from Malaika, importantly, as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, as well, for that those important words. And again, I would like to welcome other colleagues who just joined in the room as well, and including our other colleague from HTMSS, Silke Albert, as well, who is here, will help us hopefully as well during the Q&A session. With that, so we would now like to hear from Fabrizio himself about the report, and it is my pleasure, Fabrizio, to give you the floor to introduce the report. Please go ahead. You have a presentation, a clicker.
Thank you, Billy, and really a word of gratitude to our colleagues and the civil society unit and all the people, everyone that is attending this presentation. Thank you very much for your interest in our work. So the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons 2024 is the 8th edition of the Global Report, which is mandated by the General Assembly. Resolution, the United Nations Global Plan of Actions to Combat Trafficking in Persons, states UNODC has the mandate to produce, to collect and report every 2 years on trafficking in persons patterns and flows, and at national, regional, and international level. So if you are familiar with the report, you know that it's not okay. The structure of the global report is with a global overview, regional sections, and country profiles. And the structure is maintained like this, exactly to fulfill the mandates received by the General Assembly. The first edition of the report was published in 2009, and we started to work on that report in 2007, collecting data that goes back to 2003. 2003, as you know, is the entry into force of the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. So this means that we have data in our database, data that goes back to 2003. So, and with the most recent data that we have collected, and we are still collecting because data collection is ongoing, we have now 20 years of data in our global data set that is at the base of the global report on trafficking in persons. We have information on more than 600,000 victims of trafficking that have been detected in a large number of countries around the world, around 140. Of course, it depends on the year. For the edition 2024, we managed to cover 156 countries around the world. We collect data on the victims of trafficking identified by national authorities around the world. We have information about the offenders, either suspected, investigated, prosecuted, and convicted, or convicted. And we have then qualitative information that allow us to go beyond the cold statistics. The qualitative information is coming from the analysis of court files. We have a data set of 1,100 cases concluded with a conviction for trafficking in persons that allow us to understand the relations between the traffickers and the victims, the structure and the modus operandi of the traffickers, the risk factors, vulnerabilities of the victims, and so forth. So the results that I will present refer to emerge from the analysis of this data set. I'm not able to go forward. Next, please. So the first results that I want to highlight refer to the trends. Let's take a step back. In the previous edition of the report, we took a snapshot of the situation in 2020, the year of the pandemic. In 2020, what we assessed was that for the first time since 2003, we recorded a reduction in the number of victims detected, in the number of convictions finalized. And this was, of course, connected with the lockdown measures, preventing measures to reduce the risks connected with the pandemic, that have somehow reduced the ability, the capacity of national authorities as well as NGOs, for instance, to assist, identify victims, as well as the criminal justice system to finalize prosecutions and convictions. What we have, what we are seeing now in the 2022, and this is confirmed also for the preliminary data for 2023, is that the number of victims that have been identified, assisted, and the number of convictions went up, are going up since, of course, the drop recorded in 2020. At global level, we find an increase in the victims identified at plus 25% compared to 2019, so to the pre-pandemic levels. Now, not all regions, while most of the regions recorded this drop in 2020 and then more victims detected, identified in 2021 and 2022, not all regions managed to go back to the pre-pandemic, to reach the pre-pandemic levels. If we look at these charts, you will see the charts on the left represents all those regions that somehow have some trends, numbers in terms of detected victims that are, let's say, more than the one recorded in 2019. And this is mainly Sub-Saharan Africa, North America, and Western Europe. We also have countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia that recorded more or less the same number of victims identified in 2019, plus 4%. On the other chart, you will see both South America and South Asia, again, recording numbers of victims detected that are, let's say, less compared to the pre-pandemic level, but still more or less the same level, so minus 7% for both regions, while 3 regions, mainly MENA, East Asia and the Pacific, Central America and the Caribbean, that still record numbers that are far below the pre-pandemic level. So this, as far as the trends are concerned, as far as the profile of the victims, most victims detected are still adult women, 39%. But in terms of trends, what we are seeing is that compared to 2019, the number of children detected increased drastically. 31% more child victims detected in 2022 compared to the pre-pandemic level, and with a sharper increase for girls victims. All in all, girls and boys in 2022 account for 38% of total victims detected, 22% girls, 16% boys. In particular, if we look at girls victims of trafficking, an increasing number of girls detected was recorded in the Americas, so in North America, Central America, and South America, in parts of Europe, particularly Central and Southeast Europe and Eastern Europe, East Asia and the Pacific, and the MENA region. So you see, this is a global pattern. We probably just Western Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa do not record these trends. We have recorded increasing trends also in boy victims of trafficking, particularly in Europe, Western Europe, Central and Southeast Europe, and North America. And we see a relation, both in terms of trends, in terms of age of the people of concern, and nationalities. We see a relation between victims of trafficking in persons and the number of unaccompanied minors identified at the border. So let's say that in this case, we are looking at a broader phenomenon that is part of, let's say, the broader migration trends. While when we look at girls victims of trafficking, we are particularly looking at victims of sexual exploitation, mainly victims that are victims of domestic trafficking. So victims that are recruited and exploited within the same country. Please.
Just to provide the logistical information, because we now have interpretation in Arabic as well, which we were missing. And we do have it, unfortunately, in the Chinese channel, because Zoom does not have the Arabic channel. So if you're listening, those of you online and you would like to listen in Arabic, please go to the Chinese channel, and that's where you find Arabic interpretation. So I wanted to give that information. We already have almost 320 people online, so I think some of those speak Arabic, and we don't want them to miss out on this. So please go to, for Arabic, go to the Chinese channel in Zoom, and that's where you will find the interpretation. Sorry for the interpretation. Please continue. Thank you.
So always on child trafficking. So I've described the trends, increasing trends in girls victims, increasing trends in boys victims in certain regions. But in terms of absolute numbers, let's remember that child trafficking, children as victims of trafficking are mainly detected in some regions, that is Central America and the Caribbean, particularly if we look at girls, victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation, but also for forced labor, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the MENA region. A large number of victims are children also in East Asia and the Pacific, in South Asia, and so forth. Boys are more typically trafficked for the purpose of forced labor and forced criminality in increasing number. Forced criminality is on the increase, is a form of trafficking that is increasing. And girls more typically in sexual exploitation, but also in forced labor. And talking about forced labor, this is another result that is emerging in this edition of the report, with increasing numbers, again, of victims detected for this form of exploitation. Already in 2020, the previous edition of the report, we recorded an increasing number of victims trafficked for the purpose of forced labor. And for the first time, trafficking for sexual exploitation and forced labor were detected almost at equal level. This trend is confirmed and, let's say, continues for this for the numbers referring to the year 2022. So more victims of trafficking for forced labor have been detected, and there are more detection for forced labor compared to sexual exploitation. Trafficking for forced labor is more detected in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the MENA region, South America, and South Asia, but also in the other regions, we see increasing number of victims of traffic for the purpose of forced labor. And a very relevant result for policy implication is that while we see increasing number of victims trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, we do not see this reflected in the convictions. So if you look at these charts, figure 7 represent the picture of, for the year 2022, 42% of the victims are trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, 36% for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and then we have 8% of victims that are trafficked for the purpose of forced criminality, another 8% of victims trafficked for mixed forms of trafficking. Well, when we look at the convictions, so the number of people convicted for trafficking in persons and let's say the form of exploitation these traffickers engaged with, most of the traffickers are still convicted, most of the traffickers convicted are still engaging or how can I say, are those who engage in trafficking for sexual exploitation, 72%. Just 17% of traffickers convicted engaged in trafficking for forced labor. So we analyzed this discrepancy in terms of victims detected and traffickers convicted. And one of the elements that is emerging is criminal justice system had difficulties in struggling, so to say, to convict traffickers who engage in forced labor. There are many reasons trafficking for forced labor is more organized compared to trafficking for sexual exploitation. We see an increasing, let's say, more engagement of organized crime behind trafficking for forced labor compared to other forms of especially sexual exploitation. Not that organized crime is not engaging in trafficking for sexual exploitation, but we see more cases of trafficking, of organized crime engaging in trafficking for forced labor. We also looked at one interesting result, that it is the time required to secure a conviction. And if we compare this time for sexual exploitation is 24 months, for forced labor is 36 months. So on average, it takes 1 year more for the criminal justice system to convict a trafficker that is engaging in forced labor. So this is also another indication that somehow it is more difficult for the criminal justice system to convict and traffickers engaging in forced labor for many reasons. These maps represent how, when we talk about trafficking in persons, we are, let's say, and we present aggregated average figures. Sometimes this is a statistical aggregation, but in reality, trafficking in persons is taking different connotation in different parts of the world. So while we see in Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, most victims are children trafficked for the purpose of forced labor. In North America and Central America, most victims are women and girls trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. More mixed profiles in other parts of the world. In Europe, Eastern Europe, we see more victims detected for the purpose of sexual exploitation, more women and girls. Western Europe, we see women in sexual exploitation, men trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, and children, particularly boys, trafficked for the purpose of forced criminality. Let's go now to the profile of the traffickers. We conducted an analysis of the cases I was mentioning earlier at the beginning. The structure of the traffickers. How do traffickers operate? The majority of the traffickers in the cases we have analyzed do act as in form of organized crime. We have, you all know the definition of organized crime is let's say three or more people operating together in a systemic way to commit the crime, in this case of trafficking in persons. We went beyond the legal definition also to understand what type of organized crime. So 18% of the traffickers we have in our data set operate in form of an organized crime that has a governance structure, a power over a certain community, power over a certain territory, what in a normal, let's say, language we would call the mafias. 56% are criminal organizations, criminal groups that operate in terms of business type of models. So networks or groups that are working together in a less structured manners. And then we have traffickers that are, let's say, non-organized criminals, so individuals or people working together, but not in let's say, couples, for instance, or let's say three, but not in a structured manners. If we look at the organized crime, the impact, so to say, of these traffickers, organized crime groups manage to traffic more victims for more time in a more violent manners and for longer distances compared to non-organized traffickers. And this is a result that is consistent for all editions of the report. A picture of the trafficking flows now. When we look at the trafficking flows, most of the victims of trafficking persons are victims of domestic trafficking. So 58% of the victims detected in 2022 were victims that were recruited and exploited within the same countries. And this is a pattern that is recorded everywhere around the world, with the exception of two regions. One is Western Europe, the other is the Middle East. The other regions see, let's say, more victims that are victims of domestic trafficking. When we look at cross-border trafficking, most victims of cross-border trafficking are victims that are from Africa. 26% are national of a country in sub-Saharan Africa, 5% of a country in North Africa. So let's say that about 1/3 of all victims of cross-border trafficking are nationals from African countries. We also see victims from East Asia and from South Asia that have been detected in all regions of the world. So this is really a global phenomenon. So on the basis of these results, let's say the expansion of the trafficking flows within and out of the African continent, we decided for this edition of the report to have a special chapter on the African continent. This was also needed in light of the fact that Africa is normally the part of the world where we had less data, less information available. So we decided to invest in terms of resources, time, and we engage with regional actors, with ECOWAS, with SADC, with the African Union, in order to try to get more information, more data from, let's say, from countries in the African continent. We managed to cover a large number of countries, 40 countries in the African continent. And this allowed us to have a better picture of trafficking patterns and flows in Africa. And the first result is that emerged is that while we always describe the African continent as origin of trafficking persons outside Africa, mainly to Europe and the Middle East and to other regions, most of the trafficking victims are trafficked within the African continent. So from West Africa to North Africa, from West Africa to Southern Africa, an important flows was recorded from East Africa to Southern Africa. But we will also notice that there are trafficking flows from Asia into the African continent, particularly to Southern Africa. So most victims are actually remains within the African continent. Who are these victims? Well, we can flag, of course, it would be too complex now to present all the patterns emerging, but I would summarize two main profiles. One refers to children trafficked domestically or within the same subregions or within the African continent, trafficked for the purpose of forced labor, mainly boys. And this is connected with the phenomenon of child labor. Of course, in parts of the world where child labor is more severe, then traffickers may find the space to operate and to enter as a broker into this, let's say, broader phenomenon that is child labor. The other aspect that we would like to flag is trafficking persons in the context of the broader migration phenomenon. and the risks connected, the trafficking risks connected with the smuggling of migrants along African routes. So in this case, we look at the risks connected with the with smuggling of migrants, either along the routes and at destination. Contributing factors. We looked at the risk factors in the African continent, the first being conflicts. So Africa is the part of the world where where we have seen more conflicts, according to all sources we had explored, and also more fatalities. And in connection with conflicts, also large displaced population. According to UNHCR data, about 1/3 of all refugees or population that is, let's say, in a situation of forced displacement is an African national. So large displaced population are, of course, at risk of more vulnerable to be exploited. But armed conflicts also comes with the involvement of armed groups recruiting children, and large parts of the continent or the large part of the conflict areas being under the rules of armed groups. So this is also connected also with lack of rule of law in certain territories, and the exploitation of children or adults to support the activities of armed groups, which again could be in terms of combatants, but also in the extraction of mineral resources, for instance. Of course, the extraction of mineral resources is a risk area for trafficking persons, not only in conflict areas, but also in other parts of the continent, other parts of the world, especially when we look at artisanal and small-scale mining. We see that this industry or this economic sector is at risk of trafficking more than other sectors. I will close now with the impact of climate change. The climate change, of course, has impact all over the world. We know that, but the African continent is particularly exposed to climate change because of the large rural population in the African continent, and the large rural population in a situation of poverty. So of course, climate change has a greater impact on the rural population, and studies have confirmed that climate change has an impact in terms of short terms, medium terms, and long terms impact. There are studies that confirm how in the aftermath of a natural disaster, rural communities engage with let's say, practices at risk of trafficking, such as marriages, early marriages, or child labor, again, which are, of course, exposing these communities at the risk of trafficking in persons. I'd like to close with one special section that we have in this edition of the report, that is voices from the civil society. We engage in a survey, online surveys, to capture your opinions, your views on how to assist and what is more needed, let's say, to protect and assist victims of trafficking. So what has emerged from this online survey is these top 5 services that are most needed for victims of trafficking, being medical assistance, including mental health, legal support. And when we talk about legal support, is not only having, let's say, rights for the victims, but having this right being accessible to all victims. So to assist the victims in accessing these rights. reintegration services, protection of children, and repatriation services. We also ask, let's say, civil society organization to give a suggestion how to improve the chances for victims to actually refer to law enforcement. And here in these slides, the results. So first, the application on the non-punishment principle for victims of trafficking, the recognition of victim status that is not dependent on the victim's willingness to report the crime, the presence of civil society organization, NGO actors, while reporting to law enforcement, the no risk of forced repatriation and voluntary compensated repatriation pathways for victims, as well as safe and anonymous reporting lines for victims of trafficking. And with this, I close here, and I'm here to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Fabrizio, for that really very, very interesting presentation. As Ian started saying, paints a very difficult picture to consume, but a picture that is very important. Without data, it's simply impossible to implement evidence-based interventions, whether you're an NGO or you're a government. So this report is really critical. And I was observing the reactions throughout your presentations. As you can see, they're still flying on the screen. And especially, I think, when you got to the last slide where you presented how through the development, the drafting of the report, you also reached out to civil society communities to solicit input, especially on suggestions on how to do better. And I think I saw a lot of good reactions on that. I think part of what makes this report special and very unique is also that type of engagement that you have added to the development of this report, including, of course, as you mentioned, involving the students, but also through this survey to engage civil society communities as well. As I got some of the comments already that the report is easier to consume now than the previous report, and I have the feeling also that this has to do with this extra mile that you had to go to reach out to these communities as well to contribute. So thank you so much. I think there will be a lot of reactions, but the first reaction we would like to afford it to Malaika to give us, let's say, the first reflection from the civil society community of these findings from the civil society angle. What does this mean? What do you see? How do you see it? How relevant is this? What does it mean to the civil society community? Malaika, please.
Wow. I've read it. Of course, I got a PDF of it. And it's not only eye-opening, but it's also the way, the language that was used, and it also the way it spoke into what we advocates have been fighting for. For us, the statistics are not just numbers. They can kind of mirror what kind of crisis is really happening. As they mentioned, I'm a survivors advocate and a founder of Footprint to Freedom, a survivor-led organization, and also director for the African Survivor Coalition. What does it mean? That we are survivors of human trafficking on the front line, and we understand the prevalence of the human trafficking situation. But at the same time, we went through all these gaps that have been affecting victims, and we continue seeing it over and over again. In my case, it is almost 17 years ago, and I'm in my advocacy line. I cannot believe that we're still talking about access to justice, trauma-informed care, and lack of data. And also, what was very imperative this time around to hear that the data from the African region is rising. I remember, I think 5 years ago, I read a report and they were talking about child marriage and they talked about the numbers. I said, really, are this all there is? If I just walk in Uganda, I'll get, only in Uganda, I'll get even more. But I understand if the research does not include the civil society, or includes, for example, students who are proactive. I think it was only best on high-level researchers, or let's say people having PhDs, not using the common people. One thing that was missing before I dive in how this correlates with the work we're doing is the positioning of survivors in this report. I think what I could recommend as we talk about civil society and people who have been informing this tool, we need to empower survivors to be core researchers and be part of this research. Why? To some extent, you get the authenticity and firsthand experiences of survivors. Sometimes if you get the response from third party, for example, people who have worked with the survivor, it will be kind of a little bit of a different story if you talk to the survivors themselves. And which kind of survivors do I talk about? There's a difference between a victim and a survivor and an empowered survivor. If you ask me the questions that they asked me 10 years ago, it's not the same how I reflect on them, because I speak from a place of safety, place of understanding, and also the power dynamic does not affect my input. But most of these outcomes are asked with survivors who are not yet empowered, and then they are yes, and then it does not really reflect on the reality of what is happening. So I would suggest that in the civil society consortium, that survivor leaders are given a space to really inform the report. Good enough, we had, as the African Survivor Coalition, we had an opportunity to be co-writers with the UNODC recent meeting in Uganda, where we had 12 survivors from East Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa to speak into regional issues and how they think the recommendations. And interesting is that most of the stuff that have been in this report were aired out in that room. So what I want to bring the voices of those survivors in the room to kind of flag in how this resonates. One is the post-COVID era and how it has impacted survivors' recovery. On ground, most survivors who, by the way, during COVID, most African survivors who are in the Gulf states, I think we remember, had very issues returning back home. When most governments brought back their citizens, most African labor substitute women got stuck in the Middle East. So they came back with a lot of trauma. And that was not tackled because we were dealing with COVID. And after COVID, we also had a set of survivors who had, before COVID, we had reintegrated and given seed funding to start a business. After COVID, everything went all over the place. So what we realized that more vulnerability started taking place, and the survivors that we had reintegrated, who had become firm in the society, ended up going back to the Middle East because of what is happening in the economies today. So we really need to tackle in the remnants of the post-COVID, especially on survivors, because it impacts them in a different way. We're talking about data, and one of the areas that we think still need more effort is the situation of children in Africa. They talked about 31% of people exploited in Africa were children. And this is very hurtful, but at the same time, as we advocates, it has been very difficult to pass the message around because exploitation is embedded in the culture, where children are part of supporting families, and the families have got a lot of financial problems that children have to work or support their families to have a meal on the table. And when we talk about child's rights from a place of comfort, not understanding that in order for these kids to be free of exploitation, we need to empower households. So what has been happening from the West, we've been empowering kids with human rights, but we've not been empowering the homestead. So it is causing more conflicts because the West has got a different level of economic empowerment. So in our approach, when we think about how do we protect these children, we need to start from the household. And regarding the number, this 31 number looks alarming, but I think it's just an iceberg of what is exactly happening. Why? Children are working in informal economies where it's non-regulated, and these are the areas where the data is not gotten from. So you can imagine, how do we get the actual data that represent the actual situation? Because most of these cases do not reach the court. So how do we reach these people? What do we have in place that can tap in the informal economies where actually the real victims are? Also, what was very interesting and I found very captivating is flagging in the domestic servitude form of trafficking in Africa. That has been one of the things that has been normalized for years. When we talk about human trafficking and raise awareness, people think about people who have been trafficked outside their countries. And it has been very difficult to tailor awareness raising to tackle the domestic human trafficking, because it is years and years of cultural, it's embedded in culture and the social ways where a person in the village gives a relative in town to give help. And for a person from the rural area, it's an opportunity for the child to go in the city. It has been quite very difficult to really term it to them as exploitation because it has been a way of life. But now flagging it as an issue, it's going to help us in our advocacy to bring it to the attention. Forced criminality, while it's growing, it has been very re-traumatizing for victims of forced criminality. When most of the people are identified and they're taken home, they face a lot of stigma. And also there's a thin line between being a criminal and a victim when it comes to forced criminality. So most of the law enforcement focus on the prosecution. And one issue we're having, for example, the government of Uganda stated in the recent article, there are 30 victims in Myanmar who have been forced coming. But the issue is that when they are brought home, they could not access justice because of that cross-nation distance and lack of coordination. And at the same time, they did not get any mental support because they've not yet we don't have yet structures in place that kind of support victims of forced criminality. One thing that was also flagged in was survivor-centered. But I want us to move beyond survivor engagement, survivor inclusion. Being a survivor is not a skill, and I said it so many times that we're investing survivor empowerment in the wrong way. Let me give you a picture. There's a victim. If we can describe who's a victim, someone who has just left exploitation, a survivor who has gotten holistic support from mental health, from economical support to psychological to housing. Can you imagine how many survivors in Africa you could call a survivor? Most of them, I think 95%, have not gotten access to others holistic. So, which means in order for us to get real survivors, we need to invest in mental health, also putting their capacity building and access to fellowship and interviews for survivors. And one thing that was flagged in our meeting during the African Survivor Coalition was the role of the embassies. They've been very reluctant, and also they lack the capacity actually to support victims of human trafficking, because the majority of survivors say they weren't helped. And these are 12 people in the room who knocked the door in the Gulf state and they weren't helped. So these are people also we have to bring on board. Who are these stakeholders we are talking about? As we're talking about Africa, sometimes we forget the global role on how the laws, the systems that are happening around can also exacerbate human trafficking. I wanted us to step aside and rethink from the Western perspective, how have been the laws in increasing vulnerabilities to human trafficking? Because now we're looking at encouraging the African states to do something about human trafficking, but at the same time, it requires to position ourselves what is happening in Africa that is increasing vulnerability and what is happening in the West. I know, for example, I'll focus in Europe because it's where we are, that we have policies in place that are intended for anti-human trafficking, but they just exacerbate human trafficking. For instance, in order to increase border control, the EU signed a contract with Libya, with the PACT project, to trap African migrants not to cross, to come this way. Amnesty International says that with that contract, the most abuse, the amount of abuse that is happening in Libya and the detention of victims and survivors is at paramount. But then this is not now becomes a EU problem, it's a Libyan problem. But this was a contract signed between EU and Libya. But not only that, a lot of probable victims are stuck in Libya, and they've come a new form of exploitation, that is sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So when we think about human trafficking happening in Africa, we need also to think about what is happening in Europe. There is also criminalization of victims. Most victims of human trafficking mostly are treated like legal migrants, which makes reporting very difficult. It makes it very easy to trust a smuggler because people hear this news of how they are treated or they are detained. Then we give avenues for smugglers and traffickers to tap in. One thing that is consistent is focusing on prosecution rather than being victim-centered. This also has increased vulnerability to trafficking, because as they say, that the credibility of someone to be a victim, you have to have all the boxes checked to fit into the box, and survivors are not, or victims are not given time to reflect. It makes it very easy for them to be pushed back. And we know also about the kafala system, which requires us to advocate more if we do not want people to be exploited in the Middle East. In mindful of time, this is a global report, and which requires a global solution. But what I want to be clear and emphasize is that when it comes to globalization of solutions, one thing that has been happening for Africa for so many years is the export of laws and resources and ideas that do not resonate with what is happening. So what we're thinking that in order for this report to be translated, it should be really contextual and culturally and regionally tailored approach, which means for that to be viable to us, in any technical support resources that should come up, they should be informed by Africans or people who have got directly impacted by human trafficking. And also, we need to understand the cultural relevance of Africa, that its impact, how the behaviors and how people ask for justice. For example, one uprising of familiar human trafficking. It has been very difficult for survivors to ask to make their family members prosecuted because of family honor. So there are so many dynamics that play around, which we need to understand. So with mindful of time, what I would want to say that the fight against human trafficking should be diverse as the community it seeks to protect. And we hope from the African perspective that we need to acknowledge the unique challenges of Africa by tailoring solutions that embed in our socio-economic situation, but at the same time, working with survivors to be part of the solution as co-researchers, but also empower them to reach the capacity that they can be informers of the solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malaika, for that. Very really mindful reflection of this report. And I think, you know, when we think about what we are doing throughout, you know, in different parts of the house and reflecting on what you were saying, this is why we also provide opportunities like this. And I know that there are not many people in the room, but we still have about more than 340 people online following this event. It's important to hear this reflections from people with lived experience. This is really critical, I think, and it's really fundamental to our understanding of this report and our perspectives and reactions to the same and how we move forward. So you provided quite a number of recommendations as well. I think Fabrizio is listening, and colleagues, colleagues from HTMSS, we're all listening. We take this, of course, with us. And I think it was very important also that your emphasis on the localization of not only solutions, but also information, in this case, the data that we use in the reports. So I think I really want to thank you very much. And I think participants as well online for this very important reflection that you just made and the importance of involving survivors in this process moving forward and continuing to engage them as well in implementing solutions that will be based on this report. And I think also one important point that you made is that for you as an advocate, as someone working on the ground, this is an important advocacy tool as well for the communities. Because we sometimes, there's quite a lot that can be done within communities, with young people, with those affected victims themselves, but of course in your engagement with policymakers in this regard as well. I think this is also another important of this particular report. So there's a lot to reflect on, I think. And again, there are a number of colleagues in the room, there are participants in the room. We have many people online as well. So we will now open the floor for engaging with Malaika and Fabrizio and colleagues in the room as well. You can ask questions, you can make comments, you can reflect yourselves, and we will limit the reflections to a maximum of 2 minutes, just in the interest of time, so that we can take as many reflections and inputs as possible. So I will ask my colleagues who are behind the scenes on the other side to help us moderate the online contributions. I believe if you are online, please, you have to request to speak. And then my colleagues will give you they will activate your profile, and then you're able to raise your hand in order for us to give you the floor. But in person, of course, feel free to raise your hand and come in to reflect on this. And Fabrizio, I will invite you back anytime as well if you would like to say a few more words. Ian, of course, as always. Please, the floor is open to you here in the room and online. And we have a lot in the chat as well, Q&A, a lot of feedback, positive feedback on all the presentations. A lot of thanks as well going to the speakers, to Fabrizio, Malaika. I've really a lot of messages in the chat as well. So I have two interventions in the room. I start with Heather. I start here with Heather, and then I move to Darren on the other side. Heather, please. If you could introduce yourself, the name and organization, and then.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Heather Vokush, and I'm a civil society individual who is honored to support some people with lived experience, such as Malaika. Thank you very much for this panel, and Malaika, your observations were amazing, and thank you for this amazing research. My question is this: in this very challenging geopolitical context that we have coming up in 2025, what next? You know, I guess my question is, we have stated very clearly, these are some of the challenges, these are this. What I would like to hear from each of you is concretely, what is it that each of you individuals think is just job one that we need to get done right now in order to deal with this horrific element of trafficking? I know it's a very difficult question, but just a very brief response.
Thank you, Heather. Let's take the next one from Darren as well, and then we combine. We ask the speakers to respond. Darren, please.
Thanks, Billy. Hi, colleagues. My name is Darren Brookbanks. I work as a multilateral engagement officer at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And my question is for Fabrizio. I noted a point you raised about traffickers and the role of organized crime. You mentioned that 18% operate in organized crime with a governance structure, and 56% are criminal groups that operate in terms of business style model. And then you mentioned non-organized criminals make up 26%. And I just wanted to get an idea of how you got to those numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's just see if there's any question online. Not yet, no hands raised yet. So we give you the opportunity, both of you, to reflect on the first question, what to do, especially what is the most important action that needs to be taken, and how did we come up with the numbers. So over to both of you. And Ian, if you have any reflection on the question, please as well from the other. You always do.
I'll go first, Heather. I think the next step, the recommendations have been presented. I think my next step is to more coordination and more partnership, to find not only collecting resources, working together, but at the same time, also kind of invest in empowering more survivors to take a lead in informing what is happening. Maybe on a personal level, after reading this report, but of course with what we already know on the ground, the situation of children impacted with human trafficking. At Footprint to Freedom, we took a step this year to just focus on outreach in schools, mainly in rural areas. Last December, I had an opportunity to go to Uganda and just go deep. And I realized that when we talk about awareness raising, you think that a lot of people have got access to information. So we called the headmaster of school and we say, we want a space to talk about human trafficking and also mainly work with the children. And then he told me, you know what, I let you come because I was being polite, but I was like, want you to come us and tell us about traffic jam, like, because they've never heard about the word traffic. So I was so amazed how we thought we were doing much, but there's a lot of awareness needed. And this time we want to focus on kids clubs in schools, where we're going to empower youngsters to be part of advocacy, raising awareness in the communities, but taking this opportunity to kind of prevent human trafficking before it happens. So that is the next step for us, is just now investing in the young, the youth, but especially those ones who could not have access to information. One last thing is that as we know, it's a digital era, and a lot of children are exploited online. It has got good and bad. I could imagine with Africa now getting access to technology, they're going to be more vulnerable. So we want to use this time also to digital empowerment, to use it as an empowerment tool to understand how to use the computer, but at the same time to teach them about the dark web and online exploitation, and how they could be advocates for this, actually. So that is the next step.
Yes, thank you. The global report presents a policy implication chapter that we actually drafted together with our colleagues from HTMSS. And I actually take the opportunity to mention that the chapter, the section I presented on the voices from civil society is something that we drafted together with the civil society unit, with HTMSS, and also with the UNEDC colleagues that are managing the trust fund for victims of trafficking. So in the policy recommendations, we have actually a number of recommendations to address the issues that are emerging from the global report. One for all probably is that in this report, it emerges clearly how trafficking persons is evolving in terms of modus operandi of the traffickers, victims, forms of exploitation. Let's take the example of trafficking for forced criminality into online scams, for instance. So one of the recommendations that we have is to, for the counter-trafficking institutions, to look at trafficking as an evolving phenomenon and to reframe, renovate, so to say, the framework to combat trafficking in persons. Then you mentioned the, let's say, the macro picture of the political situation. There is one element I would like to flag, that is climate change. When we look at the impact of climate change in trafficking persons in Africa, we realize that actually climate change is threatening millions, the food security for millions of people in the African continent. So this is a huge thing. Of course, it's discussed in the media, but I don't think that we realize how climate change is really impacting the life of millions of people that find in human mobility as the only way to, let's say, to survive starvation. And so I think that the international community should work in terms of finding mitigation measures for the communities that are really affected by what is happening in some parts of the world, of course, not only the African continent. Another element I would like to flag is the increasing number of girls that are trafficked, because this is really a global phenomenon. And I think that we should look at this phenomenon and find again, measures to prevent this type of trafficking. Thanks. Was the question about the traffickers. So we have a number of court cases, as I mentioned at the beginning, and we have this 1,000 cases, 1,100 cases. I have information about 4,000 traffickers. So this is a sample of the number of traffickers convicted. And we studied the organization of the traffickers for these 4,000 traffickers we have analyzed. And for these 4,000, again, 56% were criminal organizations operating in network, let's say not mafia groups. 18% were mafia organizations that, and again, these 18% managed to traffic more people. I think it is 12, on average, 12 victims, which is much more than if you take the individual traffickers as the cases where we look at the individual traffickers.
Thank you. And I just wanted to respond to Heather's very important question. And see, Malaika's responded with what we can, what the NGOs can do at the ground level. But maybe from my perspective, what we can try and do in forums like this, when you consider, the way things are going politically that you've said, I think the scam centers and the kind of double criminality or the multi-layered criminality that exists in that phenomenon, I think is a symptom of the way things are going, where there's corruption, there's impunity, the rule of law is in retreat. People feel like they can do this in quite broad daylight with corporate kind of structures and with businessmen, politicians, criminals, all being the same people, not being able to tell who is who. I think there's a responsibility on us when we engage in these fora to reflect that we can't approach them in the business as usual way anymore. We can't just say, oh, well, we have a legal framework that just needs to be implemented properly. We're talking about bigger issues. So we need to make sure we're reflecting how we really see things, and bringing those experiences from the what's really going on into these fora, not just carrying on in the way that we have been, because the situation is very different. I think that's, as international NGOs, that's what we have to consider as well.
Thank you all for the responses. I just want to check in with colleagues as well, Serge and Morgan, if there's anything you'd like to list a question from Heather.
Hi, thank you. I think it has been said already, and I like the reference to better cooperation, because nobody can really fight trafficking on their own. And I like the point of us listening to those and bringing in those who have been affected by the crime. That's a major step. And I do think that a lot of anti-trafficking movements originally actually started out from people affected who have, however, not perhaps been listened to in a way. And then others took up the portfolio without, again, listening. So I do think that that's a major, very important point across the engagement, across the responses. I also noticed what Fabrizio said, in fact, trafficking in children being a major issue, and we have huge numbers of children identified. We lack, however, the knowledge what happens to these children after identification, if I'm not wrong. So I do think a lot of focus needs to go in there. And of course, I mean, one big issue is prevention. And I think as an international community, we are really, really bad at that, like to prevent it actually before it happens. And I hope that the efforts that we are doing in better understanding what happens and the modus operandi, etc., the ways of exploitation can actually help us to fill these gaps that enable and encourage trafficking and traffickers, and address them in a coherent, consistent manner. Yeah, so I think preventing trafficking is really a key issue here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sig. I think you'll probably also get the opportunity to maybe say a few things about, how you're engaging with survivors to the pact at some point. But for now, we have 17 hands raised online, so there's still a lot of interactions coming. And I'd like to start with our colleague online, Athena Morgan, I believe, who is joining us from Kenya. And then that will be followed by Anumo Bokoji, who is also online. So I start with those two, and then we seek for answers. Athena, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Billy, and thank you to the presenters. My name is Athena Morgan. I work with the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Africa, and also the convener for Kenya Civil Society Alliance. I'd like to appreciate all the contributions, but especially by Malaika, and when she was talking about exploitation being embedded in our cultures. And one of the ways that she has and the rest of the speakers have spoken about to address this is not just empowering the children, but also empowering the community for change. However, you realize that community change starts from leadership and government level. And as Ian mentioned, that we cannot approach this as business as usual. And so my comment, question would be, we use diplomacy a lot when working with governments, which is very important, but how else can we approach this to ensure that we're not giving a pat on the back to encourage crime, especially organized crime against children, but we hold governments and those in authority accountable to ensure the protection, especially in issues of organized crime and culture change and policy implementation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Athena. We move to Amumo, and then perhaps we'll take a third one. So hopefully you can take notes of the questions, speakers. We will take the third one from Tariq Kos, and then we will collect answers.
Hello.
Please go ahead. We can hear you.
Bonjour. Je suis Anumo Bokodjen. Je suis coordinateur de l'association NADAF, Nouvelle Alternative pour le Développement Durable en Afrique. Nous sommes basés au Togo et nous travaillons sur les questions de trafic des enfants et l'immigration clandestine, la lutte contre la corruption. Félicitations pour le rapport. J'ai suivi avec attention. Et ma première question est de savoir, vu la difficulté d'avoir des données, surtout en Afrique subsaharienne, et alors que vous-même vous l'avez dit, qu'il y a plus de victimes en Afrique, surtout des enfants et des femmes en Afrique subsaharienne, quelle alternative on a dans ce cas si on n'arrive pas à avoir des données avec lesquelles nous pouvons travailler? Est-ce qu'il y a possibilité que la société civile produise avec l'Alliance un rapport alternatif comme on le fait dans le cadre de l'examen périodique universel au niveau du Conseil des droits de l'homme? C'est une question que je voudrais vous poser. Et la deuxième question rapidement, c'est justement l'Afrique subsaharienne est une partie du monde qui a beaucoup de pays francophones. Bien que le rapport qu'on a présenté tout à l'heure soit riche, je constate que le rapport n'est pas traduit en français. Alors, il y a une certaine difficulté pour les ONG de cette zone de pouvoir utiliser efficacement ce rapport et aussi de sensibiliser les acteurs. Donc, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas possibilité que ces rapports puissent être traduits dans l'ensemble au moins dans les langues de travail de l'ONU? Comme ça, nous qui sommes francophones, nous pouvons avoir accès à ces rapports et pouvoir vraiment travailler. La troisième question rapidement, c'est de savoir, moi, mon organisation NADAF, nous organisons des activités au Togo de renforcement de capacité sur la Convention des Nations Unies sur la criminalité transnationale organisée et ses protocoles. Mais il nous arrive d'avoir des besoins techniques, c'est-à-dire des experts de l'Alliance, par exemple, qui peuvent intervenir à distance pour pouvoir parler aux participants lors de cet atelier. Par exemple, ce mois de janvier, nous commençons une série d'ateliers à partir du 15 janvier pour un mois. Donc, est-ce que c'est possible d'avoir des contacts comme ça pour que des personnes ressources de l'Alliance puissent intervenir à distance pour nous appuyer dans le cadre de ces activités-là? Ce sont les questions que je voudrais poser à l'assistance. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I think the colleagues online were able to get the interpretation of this, but I don't think, is there anyone who did not get in the room? Just quickly, he asked three questions. A gentleman from Togo, West Sub-Saharan Africa, at least he was describing the Sub-Saharan African situation. And in that context, also wanting to understand whether there's a possibility for civil society organizations in the region to also produce, let's say, he used the word alternative, but I suppose more shadow report of what is happening on trafficking in the region. So is there a possibility for them to do that? That was the first question. The second question was referring more to the access to this particular report, which is only in English, as he understands. And he was asking whether it will be reproduced or produced also in French, because he was speaking more for the French-speaking countries, but also at least he was also referring to other UN languages, so to allow access for others to do that. And I think the third question was more focusing on capacity building and technical assistance that civil society organizations in the region need urgently, and whether there are possibilities to also connect them with relevant colleagues. I think he mentioned the Alliance. I'm not sure if he's familiar with the Alliance of NGOs, probably as well, but obviously also referring, I suppose, to our own presence as UNODC in the region to help them, capacitate them on this issue of trafficking in persons. So in general, those were the three points that he was making. Perhaps we take those and then you reflect on those, and then we go to Tariq Kosa. Shall we start with you, Fabrizio?
Yeah, maybe I start with the last questions on data with reference to the African continent. I think we have recorded an increasing number of countries reporting an improvement in the quality of data. And for this report, again, we engage with the African Union, with Statafrique, with our colleagues of IOM, with ECOWAS. The reality of data collection in West Africa is really impressive. And the same for the Southern African region, I have to say. So I think the solution there is really, of course, capacity building from the data collection and data storage aspect. And we have started a project together with IOM on this and engaging with partners and regional organizations. So this is working out well, I have to say. Of course, our aspiration as UNODC is also to have national reports produced by national authorities on the trafficking situation in the individual countries. We have some good experience in some parts of the world. Also, I would mention the NAPTIP reports, for instance, are quite impressive on the taking a good picture of the situation in Nigeria or in other parts of Africa. Translation of the trafficking report, we are working on it. So there are, of course, some cost implications, but we are working on the translation on the relevant chapters according to the different languages. So as far as the French language is concerned, we will translate the African chapter and the executive summary, special points of interest. The same goes with Spanish for Latin America and so forth. It would take some time, but we are getting there. On the capacity building, I think that, okay, the broad capacity building activities, of course, we have our colleagues from our colleagues from the anti-human trafficking migrant section that are providing assistance together with our field offices in all aspects of the implementation of the Palermo Protocol and the counter-trafficking activities. So I don't know if you want to say something on that.
Sure, thank you. So the technical assistance refers specifically to assisting member states to implement the Trafficking in Persons Protocol and their obligations from the treaty. And that relates from anything starting from legislative assistance, so helping to translate the protocol in domestic legislation. We understand also, thanks to the global report, that most countries have legislation in line with the protocol. That means a lot of countries now, almost all countries, criminalize trafficking in persons with all types of victims, all types of forms of exploitation. However, it's also now to fine-tune the legislation and broaden it a little bit in different areas. There is still a lot of work to do. And then it goes to setting up specialized police units, supporting the judiciary, working with judges, because we also understand that even cases that are investigated well, that are prosecuted well, very often don't lead to a conviction because of and that is again where we would need the inputs of survivors, because the trauma is not considered well, because there is a lack of understanding of what the impact of trafficking can lead to, and it very often affects the credibility of victims' witnesses. So there is a lot to do in this regard. We also work with other parts of the judiciary. Of course, we work with NGOs, and the way we do that is through very often, for example, through training workshops. And we bring different participants together, so not just from courts, but multidisciplinary. That would be it in a nutshell. You said, Billy, that I could also have a word on what our plans are and what our work is in regard to survivor engagement. And just to let you as NGOs know that we work on a conference for happening this year in June this year, sorry, on 24 and 25 of June this year, where we bring survivors together with service providers, and service providers would be government service providers and non-government service providers, to discuss on issues like, for example, what justice would mean for survivors of trafficking, what the needs are, what the challenges are, but also what the good practice is that exists, things that we can promote and things that we can promote as UNODC in our role as servicing intergovernmental processes. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm sure there will be questions, but we are happy to share information material on that. Thanks.
Yes, a quick one from my colleague from Missing Children. She really analyzed and brought the context of Africa about the issue of accountability, because most, I don't want to use the word culprits, but people involved in exploitation have got high, they are high in political places, and or they're ones owning the recruitment agents. It makes it very difficult for them to be accountable. And then we leverage on the negotiation power for interagencies like the EU and the UNODC to push this. But what about us as the civil society and survivors? I think for us it's more to unionize ourselves, this can increase bargaining power, collective power. And I think this is an approach that we need to stop working in silos and push that collective approach. Flagging in with what Silk has said, I think bridging the gap between us, impacted people and the government and the community is people or agencies like the UNODC to bring out conferences or platform that kind of bring people together. I'm very happy to be part of supporting the UNODC in this upcoming event, of which else I see is that that's one of the major first step where the conference is co-designed, co-authored and led by survivors and supported by a strong agents like UNODC, and bringing the government together for us, not only to negotiate, just to kind of speak into this matter. And we hope that these recommendations that are coming from these conferences are going to be the first or second steps on making governments accountable. Yeah, and also it comes down to collaboration. When we get a collective voices, when it comes to an issue, it really helps in bringing forward an issue and sharing resources.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to some of the points raised by the gentleman from Togo with regard to civil society engagement and so on. And just to say, there's not as many, the review process for the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime is a bit different. Some of the other review mechanisms that people might used to work with. And there aren't as many civil society shadow reports yet, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be. And there are some good examples, and I believe Tariq Kos has asked for the floor. He's led a process in Pakistan with UNODC and with others. And there are a few other preliminary civil society reports on the UN TOC convention in general that have been produced, but I think we, as the Alliance, will be very keen to see who would be interested in producing civil society shadow reports on the Trafficking in Persons Protocol in particular, and where funding is available and where resources allow. I think this would be a vital contribution to the engagements around this in the future. And maybe, I don't know if Toby or somebody can put the link to the Alliance website into the chat so the gentleman can see how, if he wants to be interested, be very happy to see how we can work together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, for the answers. And just to add as well that for with regards to capacity building, we, in addition to the technical assistance work, our colleagues do, we of course provide quite a number of workshops and trainings on organized crime, particularly on UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime in the context of the AC4U project. Many of you for sure have been part of those trainings and workshops. Malaika for sure has done some of those, and some of those are self-paced online, so you can actually take them in your free time. Determine how the pace that want to take with those. They introduce you to the convention, to the protocols, and to the review mechanism of the convention, and of course they also show you the entry points where you can engage with your governments and with yourselves. And I will ask my colleague Conrad perhaps to put it in the chat so that you can take a look and sign up to the upcoming courses. And we also have in terms of creating alliances, I think working together, creating alliances is very important. Obviously, the Alliance is a main umbrella organization. But we do have also the What's On platform, which is an online platform for a community like yourselves that you can sign up to free of charge, and there are a lot of resources that you can use to learn about organized crime, about trafficking in persons. And in fact, the UNODC itself has several other online courses where you can educate yourself on this topic. So we encourage you to take a look at that as well. And take advantage of it. Now we move on to Tariq Kosa, who also asked for the floor, and then we will also ask criminologist Senhir Dal as well to take the floor. Tariq, please, you have.
Thank you very much, Billy. I am Tariq Khosa, Director, Center for Governance Research, Pakistan. I'm also Vice Chair of the Vienna-based Alliance of NGOs, and I'm happy to see Ian here present in this meeting. I have three observations on this 8th edition of this global report of 2024 Trafficking in Persons. And the research branch of UNODC should be commended for coming up with a very comprehensive report in terms of analysis and trends. I think it's the result of 20 years of cumulative database since 2003, and the trends and analysis come out are very, very informative. Secondly, focusing on Africa as a region of concern and importance and significance, I think is the strength of this report, which is requiring global attention of key stakeholders. For we can't work in silos, and together we can make a difference. So therefore, the report focusing on 40 countries in Africa, I think is a very important departure from the previous reports. This is, in fact, a very commendable effort. My next point is about the strength of this report is this in civil society survey carried out. The perspectives of civil society have been incorporated, and the 5 key priorities which are reflective of the perspectives of civil society are key recommendations for the state and civil society overall. And as Ian mentioned, that Alliance of NGOs during this Conference of Parties in October last year came up with this civil society declaration on UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And that declaration has a very important and key part on trafficking in persons, the challenges as well as recommendations. And I would recommend all the key stakeholders to really, analyze and study those key recommendations made in the civil society declaration. And I would like to also finally say that the state and civil society have to forge a joint strategy to deal with the trafficking in persons challenges. There are issues of credibility, trust, empathy, integrity, and compassion of the state actors. So therefore, it is important that the state must, take the lead and in partnership with civil society, really do something in the context of gender mainstreaming, in the context of victims, in the context of survival, and above all, the human rights perspective, which is a key priority for civil society. I must once again commend the research branch for a very comprehensive report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tariq, as well, for your continued work and engagement. And I just want to note that as you know, the evidence of the effectiveness of society work also is in Pakistan. I think Tariq has done quite a lot of work, which as part of the work, we understand that the Trafficking in Persons Protocol was also, if I'm not mistaken, Tariq, you can correct me, was also ratified by the government following the engagement of civil society in a recent, I believe, not long ago. So that also shows when civil society are proactively involved, engaging with the government, certainly a lot of success can happen. So there was no question from Tariq, if I understood correctly. Let's go to Senhir Dal, and then we take a question also from Titus. Senhir, please go ahead. Okay, Senhir Dal, if you could pose your question, please, or make your comment. Otherwise, we move on to Titus Wabwire for the question or comment. Titus, please.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Titus Wabwire from Kenya. I'm the director of Busia Beyond Crime, also known as BBC. We work on organized crime, addressing terrorism, and right now we are in partnership with the Freedom Fund of Britain, addressing child domestic workers, exploitation and abuse. I just want to thank all of you for the elaborate report and contribution, especially Malaika, where you've reflected on the community. On the issue of child domestic work, which is part of modern slavery, the exploitation has been, this has been like a tradition, as she rightly put it. You find that in Africa, using these children to work for others has not been known to be a debacle until the other day when Freedom Fund came in to show the need for prevention of exploitation and abuse. So when we were implementing the prevention, we decided to use community policing. And this is a concept that we work together with the law enforcers. And in the process, we build the capacity of the community to a level that, because the perpetrators are the community and the victims are the community. So ours being proactive prevention, you find that by building the capacity of the community, it has been very, very effective in addressing this problem of human trafficking. But the biggest problem is that the magnitude of the work, or rather the implementation, is small. So you find that when you build a capacity of the community to understand, as Malaika put it, you find that the community is not aware, and yet the problem is so rampant. And because of the economic problem, you find that they are just complacent. So by building their capacity, it has enabled us to address this problem at the border of Kenya and Uganda, which are the source and also the recipient countries, to a level that it has reduced. So we call upon UNDC to also come in, and we can partner. We shall be sharing on what we have been doing. We have also addressed what Fabricio mentioned on climate change. We realize that even the community itself is able to address this problem. So we have trained the community on a community emergency response team, and they are doing it so well. So we really appreciate this platform, and we hope that by working closely, we can also share, and we can share with you and see what we are doing on the ground that is impacting this problem, despite the fact that resources is the biggest problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. I understand there was no question, but rather really also an emphasis on the needs to continue building the capacity of communities, which also Malaika has been emphasizing. Thank you so much, Titus, for that. We then go to Rosie, or Rosie, and then Heidi. And if anyone in the room as well would like to take the floor, please to let us know. I see Olivier, then we go next to you. So we go to Rosie first and then Heidi.
Hello, Billy. I am from Mexico. We have been fighting since 2005, opening the first shelters in Mexico. And well, after all these years, we find that it's very difficult to fight against the big mafias in the countries, like it has happened with DDCOMs in the United States. It's also the biggest problem when this is music industry or entertainment involved, because there is a lot of kleptocracy, a lot of people that are politicians and very strong people fighting against the organizations that helps the victims. So I don't know how, but I think if we focus first on these big issues in the countries, big problems, and we find a way to punish these industries that are doing a lot of damage to the children, I think it will be a punishment that will be a history, and we will send a big message that will end the big industry of human trafficking. Also, I would like to congratulate Rim Aslam because of that report that she has published in many languages that speaks about the violence that is behind the prostitution. So I think big industry of human trafficking has to be punished in our countries for sending a message that human beings are not for sale. Thank you, and Malika, you are amazing, and people like you should be leading everywhere in the world. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosie, as well, for the important work that you're doing in Mexico. Thank you so much. Heidi, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I work with a project in Brazil called the Instituto Terra, Trabalho y Cidadania that for over 25 years has addressed international trafficking for forced criminality. Women are tricked and then coerced into carrying drugs out of Brazil to other countries, women from other countries. I appreciate, Malaika, what you said about the issue of forced criminality. And my comment and question is that, as you said, the criminal charge is an easy target for law enforcement and justice systems. And it's very hard to have these women recognized as victims of human trafficking and treated and assisted as survivors and victims. I just don't want to add this. I want to add this because the conversation about forced criminality mostly has to do with online crime and not so much drug trafficking, which of course globally gets a very negative view. And so it's easier to condemn people than to work with or assist or prevent. So my question is, do you hear this from other countries? Is this unique to Brazil that borders many coca producing countries? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. We take the question here in the room from Livia, and I think that will be the last question, unfortunately, and then we will need to close. Livia, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Billy and Fabricio and everybody who was working on the report. So my name is Livia Wagner from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and I'm the thematic lead on human trafficking. So I've been following the launches of these reports, and it's really great to see how the team is working on trying to depict the prevalence and the scope of human trafficking, and of course also the collection of data across the years. And I also wanted to congratulate Malaika to give the space to survivors and to emphasize why it's important that survivors have a seat at the table, because I think we need to have these more inclusive conversations and not always talking to the same people. I was now looking at the report. I was wondering if you were able to collect data on the role of technology. So that means when looking at the different technology as an accelerator, when we're talking about the modus operandi of the traffickers, but also when looking at the solutions and how we could more be talking about potential of AI and things like that. Is that something that has come up in the feedback to the report?
Okay, so we collected the answers to two questions, and then we will close. So those of you who are online, we apologize already in advance. There are still many hands raised, but unfortunately, due to time limitations, we're not going to be able to take your questions. But please put them in a chat as well, and we might be able to pick them up and try to respond to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the fact that we are growing into it's not only morally that we have to include people with lived experience, but also giving them a platform to kind of share their views. And thank you again for this opportunity. As always, I bring the voice of others. I've got the opportunity to work with hundreds of survivors. So it makes it also bring their voices near. The question about technology, as you, in my reference, I just realized that as a civil society and survival-led organization, we've seen that Africa is a bit behind when it comes to having this technology. And then we forecast that the minute that they're going to have all this access, with the naivety, the online abuse is going to get actually hiked. So for us as tapping in prevention before it happens is like we are thinking that we are going to move in schools or rural areas where these people do not have access to information to start raising awareness about this. But at the same time, also empower them with technology know-how. Because most of the time, for example, people we've helped then footprint is that people support when they're applying for a job online. Mainly it's not them because they don't know how to type or they don't know how to read. So because of lack of ownership of understanding how to use these tools, the traffickers take advantage of that. So we just want to focus on digital empowerment, make it accessible in our next 2 years, and hope that in this way we are able to tap in human trafficking before it happens, but at the same time, give that empowerment, as you say, the digital environment is changing and we need to adapt. And we need to start with the young generations because they are more vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah, on the forced criminality and the drugs trafficking, yes, we do report about this phenomenon. Actually, this is happening in different parts of the world. We have a box in the global report that is reporting about how drugs cartel are making use of children for the purpose of drug trafficking. And so this is actually the largest number of victims in forced criminality are for the purpose of drugs trafficking. And we included the box on trafficking person for the purpose of online scams that is somehow summarizing a research that has been conducted by our UNODC colleagues based in Bangkok. They have produced and are producing a number of studies on this issue. So we found that it was, let's say, more convenient for the report and also to disseminate the study of these UNODC colleagues to summarize their studies in this box. And there I get to the questions from Livia. So from what is emerging from these studies that we have summarized in this box, the constant evolution of these criminal organizations, even in the last, let's say, edition of these studies, the use of artificial intelligence to, let's say, amplify the impact of these online frauds. We would like to have, let's say, a special chapter on, or a special section on the use of technology. We did in the past, in the 2020 2020 edition of the global report, we have chapter 5 that was only focusing on the use of information technology. And also in the 2022 edition, we actually had a box on the technology used to prevent and combat trafficking persons using information technology instruments. So It's something that is evolving and we should monitor. Of course, not everything is possible, but we try as much as possible to keep an eye on this issue. Thanks.
So thank you so much, both of you. Colleagues, we've come to the end of this. Unfortunately, we do not have time to take more questions, but really would like to extend my special thanks to Malaika for really bringing this very special insights into this discussion. As everyone has already mentioned, I think everyone is very thankful to you for, of course, bringing the voices of survivors into these discussions, and we hope to see more of this. And we, of course, we look forward to continue engaging with you moving forward. And to you, Fabrizio, of course, as always, thank you so much for the work that you do on this report every year, and your team, colleagues from HTMSS, I work with you on this, obviously everyone involved, and also those civil society organizations and young people who have been brought into this to contribute to it. So it's been very, very important. So we understand from this discussion today that the fight against human trafficking requires really our continued commitment and collaboration from all of us, government, civil society, young people, academia, even the private sector. So everyone has a role to play here, and we are looking forward to continuing this engagement with you. And certainly from UNODC side, we will continue to engage this through the Alliance and our other members to continue bringing these voices and allowing these discussions. And in that regard, just maybe to flag one thing, one opportunity that is coming up, to continue discussing not only trafficking in persons, but other issues related to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime through the so-called constructive dialogue. So just to flag that the next one on firearms will take place on the 30th of April, which will be followed by the one on technical assistance and international cooperation, which will be taking place on the 2nd of June. And the deadline for applications for NGOs, academia, private sector is still open until 31st of January, sorry. And my colleague Conrad is going to put the link in a chat so you can apply. And there will be an opportunity to engage on trafficking in persons later in a year. So if you sign up and you follow our activities, you will be able to know when that will take place so that you can continue to engage with us. So with that, thank you very much, panelists, and to you participants and our interpreters as well who are behind the scenes, and also a special thanks to my team that really has been behind the scenes doing this, and to our partners Alliance for making this possible. So thanks so much and all the best to you.